If you've been dealing with SIBO and someone told you to take binders like charcoal, zeolite, or humic acid, I want you to stop for a moment because these aren't the binders that your body's missing. And in fact, the real reason SIBO lingers has nothing to do with detox binders at all, but everything to do with a broken immune barrier. Let's start with what matters most, the facts and the fix. So even if you only stay for a minute, you're going to leave with value. SIBO produces toxins, metabolic waste from those bacteria, and many of these are what are known as antigens. These are foreign particles that your immune system has to deal with. They exacerbate the condition and oftentimes are a trigger for many of the symptoms that are associated with SIBO. But your body has one natural binder for these in the gut. It's called secretory IgA. And when secretory IgA is low, SIBO thrives. These immunoglobulins, these are the real binders. They neutralize the toxins that are associated with the bacteria. It's not just about binding them, it's also about neutralizing them as well. And if you want to reduce the SIBO symptoms, you don't need to keep taking binders like zeolite and charcoal and humic acid. You need neutralizers. You just want to change the whole ideology of the way you think about these. Neutralizers over binders. Secretory IgA and some of its like molecules, these other immunoglobulins, these are what we're looking for. And these can be supplemented in through serum bovine immunoglobulins. That's generally an easy supplemental way to get these in. But the point is that these are going to restore the function of your secretory IgA and overall better balance the microbial environment that is often associated with SIBO. Now, I'm just getting started on this whole conversation around binders. There's so much more here to say. But if you like what you've heard so far, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button. And while you're at it, why don't you go ahead and leave a comment. Maybe you can tell us if you tried binders and what the outcome with those were for you. So go ahead and stick around because the details that I'm going to share with you from here on, they're going to completely change the way you think about SIBO and this binder conversation. Now, if you've never seen one of my videos, I'm Dr. Arland Hill. I'm a clinician and a rancher, and I've seen both sides of it, the physiology and the food. And I've spent over 25 years helping folks overcome their chronic digestive issues by focusing on what really matters, not by chasing trends and faddish new supplements. So when I tell you that SIBO doesn't persist because you're missing charcoal or zeolite or whatever else gets named as a binder, but because your immune system has lost its neutralizing capacity, that perspective comes from years of clinical work and following principles that align with your biology. Likely the first clue that you have SIBO is the list of symptoms that it's associated with. You're experiencing these, they're irritating, they're disrupting your life, and these symptoms are a byproduct of that overgrowth of bacteria. But it's not just the overgrowth that's the problem, it's what gets released with that overgrowth. For example, you have what are often called LPS, an abbreviation for what are known as lipopolysaccharides. These are toxins that are produced by the bacteria that begin to circulate in the body. In addition to that, beyond just those direct toxins, you also have what we could think about as bacterial debris, just components of the bacteria that get released into the system that your immune system recognizes as not natural human tissue, and it starts to develop a response against it. These bacteria also produce various metabolites. Some names you won't recognize, some names you will. For example, D-lactate, not one we commonly talk about, but ethanol, well, you guys all know that as alcohol, definitely one we talk about. And this creates symptoms like brain fog and fatigue. And then, of course, you have all the gas byproducts like the hydrogen, the methane, the hydrogen sulfide. These are what begin to irritate the small intestine and activate the immune system. That's when everything is going wrong. That's what causes the symptoms. But what does a normal immune system look like here? I think if we understand what a normal immune system looks like in this context, Then we can begin to see why the immunoglobulins, what I'm going to call the neutralizers, are a better option than binders. So the primary immunoglobulin, just an immune system protein there, the primary immune system protein that we're looking for is secretory IgA, SIGA. And this protein, this immune system protein, immunoglobulin, is found in the mucosa. So you have your gut lining, and then you have the mucus layer, and there's actually two separate mucus layers there. They're blended together, but you have what's called an inner and an outer mucus layer. But the point of this is that creates a barrier between what is moving through the gut and the interaction directly with the gut lining. When that mucus layer gets thinned out, we begin to see more problems, and this is also where we see the predominance of the secretory IgA. And the reason that is there is because that secretory IgA can begin to neutralize these foreign materials before they ever have a chance to interact directly with the gut lining, or even worse, if they end up crossing that gut lining. So it literally blocks these toxins from doing the damage that they are often associated with, which means that there's also an inhibition of all the inflammatory process that is typically initiated behind that. But when that secretory IgA is low, and that there's often a compounded effect here. And what I mean by that is that you don't just typically run into a low secretory IgA, you have thinner mucus along with that secretory IgA. And the combination of those means that this foreign material moving through there, regardless of what the name of it is not getting neutralized. These toxins are reaching the gut lining and they're having a direct interaction with that. There's more inflammation associated with it. This is where the gut lining starts to not repair efficiently, and then you begin to have this leakiness, if you will, what's often over the years been talked about as leaky gut. But more importantly, you have also the accumulation of activation by your immune system. Your immune system just gets ramped up, and this is where the effects that are happening in the gut, in the small intestine, can begin to go elsewhere in the body, and you see all these connections and all these different systems throughout the body having tie-ins back to the dysfunction in the gastrointestinal tract. But it came about because there was this low secretory IgA, there was an inability to optimally neutralize what was moving through, and the SIBO begins to persist. But yes, when you look at the secretory IgA in this context, it does bind to these toxins, but what it's really doing is it's neutralizing these toxins, and it's the neutralization that's the real missing link here. And this is why I want to differentiate from what we often talk about as binders, and frankly why most binders just fail. And some of the binders, you'll probably be familiar with some of these names: charcoal, zeolite, humic acid, fulvic acid. These are the most common ones that get tossed around out there, and they all have more or less a general consistent theme around them, a consistent appearance, if you will, which is that they're relatively porous. So if you think about a sponge would be a good analogy to this. They're relatively porous, and cage-like is how that's often described. And so cage-like meaning that can trap in various toxins, but they have an absorptive capacity. For example, they do pretty good with things like environmental toxins, heavy metals. If you run into some organic compounds or chemicals, maybe even chemicals that come around as a byproduct of, say, mold exposure, those kinds of chemicals, they work pretty good like that, right? But they're functioning from an absorptive standpoint, and if you think in regards to a sponge, if you sit a sponge on some water and it absorbs in that water, that's what we're talking about. But these aren't immune molecules, which means that they don't have the capacity to develop a specific response. They're very non-specific in nature. And that's where we start to see a big differentiation between the immunoglobulins, specifically secretory IgA, that your body produces versus these binders. Charcoal, zeolite, humic acid, fulvic acid. They don't have the capacity to mimic secretory IgA, and that's really what the most important aspect of this is. They're just not going to mimic the secretory IgA. And you remember, secretory IgA is your neutralizer, and it's highly specific. It is a developed response. And as a part of that, when you don't have that highly specific response. And remember, I said secretory IgA was operating in the mucosal border. And so when you optimize secretory IgA, you're also taking moves to optimize the mucosal layer, that border between the lining of the gut and what's flowing through the gut. Binders, the classical binders, if you will, they don't have the capacity to do that. They don't rebuild that mucosal layer in any way. They don't work at what's called the brush border, which is that direct interface at the gut lining. They don't have any way of directly balancing inflammation like the immunoglobulins can do. And maybe what's most important about this, if we're trying to keep an approach that's very evidence-based, and we're not just working off of theory, but we're working off of established mechanisms of action. We don't have any clinical trials for the use of binders like charcoal, zeolite, humic acid, fulvic acid in the context of SIBO. The application for these binders is outside of the context of SIBO. And I'm not suggesting that there's not a role for these. I'm just suggesting that they're not ideal in SIBO, and that when you're looking to try to introduce a binder or a neutralizer, something to grab up these toxins that are associated with SIBO, it makes far more sense to try to either bolster your secretory IgA level directly or to introduce other sources of immunoglobulins. I'll talk more about that here momentarily, to introduce those other immunoglobulins to get the response that you're looking for. And this is where we want to try to align with the physiology, and we don't want to try to work in discord with the physiology. We don't want to just put things in the body to put things in the body for the sake of maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. We want to try to take actions that are going to align with what our physiology is looking for. You're trying to solve an immune neutralization problem here with a mineral absorptant. Those two things are misaligned. We don't want to take that strategy. Now, I also want to point out, let me just reflect back for a minute, if you will, that if you'll recall, I said I'm a rancher. And so the conversation around humic acid and fulvic acid is not one that I'm not familiar with. Fulvic acid and humic acids play an important role in agriculture. I mean, I've read and studied about these things over the years, and they bind metals in the soil and they help plants pull in the nutrients that they need. And that's all great, and there's a phenomenal application there, but that does not translate into the human small intestine. In humans, the immune system neutralizes antigens with antibodies, right? This is not soil chemistry. This is the biochemistry and the physiology of the human small intestine. So let me walk you back through a recap here with these as I guide you into the solution on this. And the real binder, well, the real binder is a neutralizer. That's what you want to think on here, neutralizers. And so the neutralizer that I'm going to recommend, that in scenarios like this where we need to introduce something to bind up that excess load of these bacterial toxins that are associated with SIBO, we want to use a physiology match solution. We want something that works in alignment with human physiology and biochemistry, and the answer to that are going to be serum-derived bovine immunoglobulins. So these are the immunoglobulins from bovine or from cattle sources. And the reason that these are so valuable is that, one, they bind and neutralize being the key word here, they neutralize these antigens to prevent them from having any further deleterious, damaging effects. They neutralize some of the specific ones like lipopolysaccharides. We know specifically with that. I'll throw this in too, that they neutralize some of the toxic components associated with H. pylori, and H. pylori can be a predecessor for SIBO. It can set the stage for SIBO. So this can be, these serum bovine immunoglobulins can be something that can support both directly SIBO, but also address what sets the stage for SIBO. They're going to have a calming effect on the immune system because they work at the top of the cascade. Remember, if you don't activate the immune system, you don't kick off those inflammatory cascades, you don't damage the gut lining, and all of that downstream dysfunction that normally would manifest, that doesn't manifest when you have these immunoglobulins in place. You're going to protect the integrity of the barrier, the villi, the brush border that I mentioned earlier, that direct interface, all of that gets protected. The symptoms are going to be reduced. Motility oftentimes is going to be directly improved with this. The secretions throughout the GI tract are improved as well, and you're going to have a more balanced terrain overall in the gut for long-term correction. In fact, there's specifically evidence where just introducing these immunoglobulins modulates the bacterial profile in the gut in a positive direction. Well, that's phenomenal. We don't see that same outcome when we look at these more classical absorptant type binders. They don't have that modulatory capacity over your bacteria, your microbiota, however you want to say that, in the GI tract. And so this is why it's so important to optimize that terrain in full with what is naturally found there, which is the immunoglobulin. Now, these serum bovine immunoglobulins, there's some very key sources on these. If you particularly are matching up with what I'm talking about in this video and you need a source for this, I've got a link for you down in the description that you can source what I would trust as my go-to serum bovine immunoglobulin source. And a good way to think about this is that you're not trying to detox the gut. That's not necessarily the strategy here, right? This is more about restoring your immune system surveillance is what we're looking for. And that's why it's not about binding, which is more of a detox philosophy. It's more about neutralization, which is more of an immunological mindset. Now, I do want to just touch on a few final things here. When you're looking to use these immunoglobulins, you have to make sure that you're using a therapeutic amount on this. Somewhere between 2.5 to 5 grams per day is what's going to get you there. Many individuals, when they get this in the system, especially if they've had difficulty with some of the antimicrobial approaches for dealing with SIBO, introducing these immunoglobulins and restoring this immune surveillance component can be a real game changer. And within a week or two, many individuals are going to see benefit associated with this. I also think it's important to note that not everyone needs this, and it's valuable to be able to look at a stool test where you can directly see what your secretory IgA levels are, and you can really put a number to this entire conversation that I'm going through with you today. And again, just for many individuals, though, the pairing of these antimicrobials with the immunoglobulins does work really well. And the other attribute here is that it doesn't matter what form or variation of SIBO that you have, methane, hydrogen sulfide, it doesn't matter. The immunoglobulins are an important part for this. You need the immune surveillance regardless of what your particular profile is. So if your immune system isn't neutralizing toxins, your small intestine, frankly, is operating without any type of shield, and you need the immunoglobulins to be able to serve and to rebuild that shield. If you've been chasing binders and nothing has changed, it's because binders, they don't fix SIBO. Restoring immune neutralization, that fixes SIBO. If this has helped you rethink your SIBO approach, well, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe, and make sure you share this video with someone who's still stuck in that detox cycle. And if you want to understand the next step in the process here, which is repairing the terrain of your gastrointestinal tract, well, go ahead and watch my next video, why SIBO keeps coming back and how to fix the terrain once and for all.